I'm serious in asking that question. Yes? And how are they saying they're responsible for my good looks and my intelligence? That's like, so they just gave me lots and say, there we go. So one way I can interpret that is they're saying, all right, it's a backhanded compliment from them. So they're like, okay, you're good looking, you're intelligent. It's all up to debate anyway, but you're these characteristics, and we gave you those genetics that led to that. How else could you interpret that? Walk louder. Right, so they brought me up. So maybe how I hold myself, maybe my ability to progress in terms of academics and intellectual ability. Maybe it's not because of genetics. Maybe it has to do with the way that they raised me. And they raised me in a loving environment. They provided me with books and resources. And maybe that's why they can say, you're welcome for this. However you interpret it, the ideas behind that card, which again is just like awesome that I got that, lay out in the ideas that when you think about anything to do with human behavior and mental processes, when you talk about psychology, there's two sides to this coin. Some things we can argue are influenced by biological factors, maybe genetics. Some things are going to influence by nurture, our environment, situations that we're in, the way that we're raised. Those two constructs, nature versus nurture, pretty much come up throughout the entire discipline when you look at psychology. This textbook, I like how this textbook is set up because it has a separate chapter on nature and nurture, but you have to take into account, you have to think about this, it plays through everything. They've just given it special factor in terms of the known chapter, but everything we talk about this entire year or semester is going to be, you're looking at some things are going to influence this way, some that, and more likely than not, it's a combination of the two, an interaction of the two that lead to it. So far, in terms of like content, we started out historically, we talked about psychology as a discipline, research methods. We went into the brain and the biology behind behavior, which clearly we focused a lot on the nature side of that, the development of the structures, the processes. We went into consciousness, and we talked about sleep cycles. And like as an example, if you think about sleep, said sleep is one of the functions regulated by a biological clock. We know that we have an area in the hypothalamus, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that houses the sleep cycle biological clock. We know physiological activity goes on, we start to get tired, we go to sleep, we go through these stages, all that's happening. Which is clearly, I'm saying there's a biological mechanism behind it. But at the same time, I also know that sleep is not entirely regulated by biological mechanisms because you might feel tired and you're like, no, I've got a test or a party to go to, and so you stay up. We know how much you sleep is influenced by the amount of light and dark. So I could artificially increase the amount of light, and you would probably spend less time in sleep, or maybe I can increase the amount of darkness, and maybe you'd spend more time. Your environment, whether you're stressed out, things are going on, there's many other factors. So even something that has a pure biological start, you can say it's influenced by both nature and nurture. So again, we're going to talk about these constructs. We'll start off talking about how nature kind of plays a role, the different ways that psychologists study it. We'll end the class talking about some of the ways that nurture could play a role. But just to start with, one of the things when we talk about how we differ, so we're all humans, we all have mainly the same chromosomes, patterns, we share 99+% of the genetic material. We've got individual variation within that. How do you account for that individual variation? So, for instance, we just took our test. Okay? Some individuals in here did phenomenally well on the test, and I had several 98s. There were actually some hundreds, but there were a bunch of 98s. And some other individuals not do so well. And there were a few 48s.
Damn.
Okay? So I've got individuals here taking the same test, and I got one group of individuals that scored a high A with a 98, another group of individuals that scored an E with a 48. And I want to know why. That's variability. Okay? The mean was 75. Variability has to do with deviations away from that. So some people scored higher than the mean, some people scored lower. Most of the scores were clustered around the mean, but there is variation in those scores. How can I account for that? What factors are going to influence whether you scored 98 or 48? And I'm asking that to you. What do you think? Say it again. Absolutely. We're going to operation define it. Very well. So the number of hours or the number of minutes that you spent studying, I would absolutely say that's going to have an impact on your performance in there. What else do you think does? Yes? Say it again. How much sleep that you got. We talked about sleep is going to impact performance. What else? Yeah. So attendance to class. Maybe the more times you came to class, the more information you got, it's going to increase your score on it. Other things? You think influence? So if you think about it again, you can think I've got one cluster of individuals that score high and one cluster of individuals that score low. Are the commonalities between the two that I can use to explain that variance in behavior? So yes, maybe how much you studied, how much you slept, maybe nutrition. Any other factors that you think influence difference in performance outcomes in terms of that test? Yeah. Okay, so possibly if you actually went to supplemental instruction, or you went to the tutoring, or you went to the reviews, maybe those factors could play into a role. Now, everything that's been mentioned so far, I would say that's the nurture side. That you're saying things that influence performance are based on these situational factors, what you're doing. Are there any nature aspects? Not quite that nature. So, yes, maybe when it's rainy out, you do more poorly. But nature in terms of internal characteristics of the individual. So do you think, so maybe attention span, and maybe attention span is something that is biologically related. Yeah. So whether or not you have anxiety, and maybe anxiety is an internal regulation, it's physiological arousal that goes on. You think intellect, intelligence has any role in how well you perform? And then the further question of that is, do you think intelligence is biologically determined? Okay, so there, I'm using one example to show you that pretty much anything you name, you can think there are going to be biological influences and nurture influences, and the interaction of those are going to lead to the end product. And that was performance. Think about something simple. Think about height. So I'm like 5 feet 9 inches tall. Why am I 5 feet 9 inches tall? What factors influence height?
Genetics.
Still asking a question. May I have any ideas? What factors influence height? Say it again. Nutrition does. So if I most likely, if I did not have good nutrition growing up, I would not have made towering 5'9". My wife's 5 feet, so I can say towering. So, yeah.
Your parents?
What about my parents?
Your parents' height?
Your parents' height. Because we know that height also is genetically related. And if I had to take a guess, I'd say most of height is related to genetics. Any variations outside of that are probably due to nutrition being one of them, but other factors that could influence height. So if you had a disease early on, that could have an impact on it. If you think about, again, anything, what about intellect? What about my intelligence? So my parents at least think I'm smart. Is intelligence more related to genetics? And if it is, then it was a good compliment for them, because I think I am intelligent, and so they gave me my genetics, so it should come from intelligent individuals. Knowing what I know in terms of like the research, I think of my kids. Before my my kids were born, my wife and I were like, all right, let's look at characteristics that we have. What are our kids going to be like? And so we're like, well, we're probably going to have, we think, intelligent kids. We're probably going to have kids that have curly hair, because although you cannot tell it from me, when my hair goes long, I have like ringlets when I grew up. I had like really curly hair in the back. And my wife's hair is just like ultra curly. So we're like, that's probably a physical characteristic that is determined by genetics. We're probably going to have curly haired kids. One of them is, one of them isn't. And if you think about that planet, you're like, what are those factors? What you're looking at is what genetic traits, what characteristics are influenced by genetics versus what characteristics are influenced by other factors outside of genetics or outside of biology. From the researcher standpoint, we want to know what influences us in many different ways. And there's a field within this that's called behavioral genetics that tries to study the interplay between heredity and environmental factors and how they influence human development. So I can throw out all kinds of scenarios. How much of my intelligence do you think is influenced by genetics? Do you think of personality? So I'm really outgoing. Were my parents outgoing? How would I even know if I was somebody in this field and I wanted to try to account for, explain differences in behavior, differences in outcomes? How would I even go about studying? If I had an ideal world for an experiment, not an ideal world probably in general, ideal world for an experiment, and I could mass produce clone babies, and I could form babies that are 100% similar, and then I didn't have ethical constraints, and I could raise those kids in different environments and purposely manipulate the variables. And I'm going to put some kids in an extremely harsh environment, and I'm going to put other kids in a great environment. And since I know they're clones, everything's the same, if I control everything about it, and I have my manipulation of my independent variable, I accurately measure whatever my dependent variables are, I control all these extraneous variables, I even randomly assign my clones to different conditions, then I'd have an awesome understanding of the way that either biology or the environment impacts us. In this world, we can't do that. For one, I don't have clones of humans. For two, I can't put them in artificial environments. It's totally unethical for me to do something that I think might cause harm. So if I can't use the experimental design to find out how people are differentially affected by biology versus environment, what can I do? How can I even study this? How would I even know if a given characteristic like extroversion is actually genetically related? Any thoughts? What would give me any sense? And I'm telling you, I could not use experimental design with humans. Yeah? Okay, so I could look at like my family, my parents. So maybe you do comparisons yourself. So we know if you have any, even the most basic fundamental background in genetics, you probably know like certain physical characteristics are determined by a single gene. Like eye color, blood type. You can look and see. I know, so like my blood type is B. I can tell you what it would exclude my parents from having blood types for me to be B. Neither one of them could have been A homogeneous, where they're both A's. I know my eye color is determined. And for me, here you can make your own decision. Eye color, I have blue eyes. No one else in my family has blue eyes. So my parents, neither of my parents have blue eyes, neither of my siblings have blue eyes. Should I be worried that my parents are not my biological parents? Anybody know? I mean, I could be worried, I suppose, but is it impossible to get blue eyes if none of my siblings are my parents? No, because it's possible that they're heterozygous, that I happen to get a little B for blue, and I'm pretty certain that's how it worked, just because I look so much like my father especially. So we know a little bit about how that genetics work. But when I can't do carefully controlled studies, now I'm like, okay, I can compare me to my parents. I can compare me to my siblings. I can compare me to my grandparents or to my children and maybe someday grandchildren. And if genetics play a role, you should see similarities across them. Now, how do we even think about it? Okay, well, I can't just look at people and go, well, you look similar to your parents, so that must mean genetics play a role. We have to be a little bit more systematic as scientists. And so one way to start with, to kind of give us a clue, is we do, in fact, look at family studies. We look to determine, does a relationship exist between amount of genetic similarity and the similarity on whatever characteristics you're interested in. And we measure this with correlation. So hopefully, from our earlier classes, you have a good understanding of correlation. If you recall, correlation tells us, does a relationship exist? What direction is that relationship? How strong is that relationship? And so if you imagine how this would go in a family study. So if I look at my parents, either one, let's say my mother, I know for sure that my mother gave me 50% of my genetics and my father gave me 50% of my genetics. Exactly 50%. I got half my genes from my mom, half my genes from my dad. Okay? So I can say that relationship, there's 50% shared genetics with either one of my parents. If I look at my siblings, on average, my siblings and I share 50%. But it doesn't have to be 50%. It's really anywhere between 0 and 100%. But on average, I'll share 50% of them with my siblings. If I go to my grandparents, I'll have 25% similarity with my grandparents. So we can look at it statistically and say, what percentage of your genetics do you share with any family member? And then what I would do is say, whatever the characteristic is, so I want to know, is extroversion, outgoingness, talkativeness, is that something that is genetically related? Well, then what I have to do is get a measure of extroversion. And so how this would work, instead of doing it for a single, I'm not talking about me and my parents, I want to know, is extroversion genetic? When a family study, I'm going to get a whole bunch of people. I'll get everybody in this classroom. You all take the extroversion-introversion scale. Your parents take the extroversion-introversion scale. We'll just say one parent takes that scale. And then I look at what's the correlation, okay, between your score and your parents' score. How similar are they? And then I look at, across a variety of circumstances, I could look at parents, how similar, siblings, how similar, grandparents, how similar, cousins, how similar. And let's say that I find that the stronger the relationship, 50% from parents, has the strongest correlation in extroversion. Grandparents, 25%, is less strong, but it's stronger than cousins, which are only 12.5%. And if I see that relationship, that the more genetically related you are, the more similar you are on these characteristics. Does that tell me? Does that prove to me that genetics play a role there? Yay or nay? What do you think? Well, I can tell you there's no way it proves it. Because here's an argument. So, my parents gave me that card. Maybe I am smart and good looking, similar to them because of genetics, but maybe it's because of the way that they raised me. And maybe it has nothing to do with genetics. And when we just look at a family study, I can't tease those two apart. You're raised by your parents. So because you're more similar to them, it makes sense. You're around them more frequently. So I can't separate biology from environment when I look at a family study. Now, if I got a zero correlation, there is zero correlation between children and their parents, between an individual and his siblings, no relationship, then I can pretty much rule out genetics. I can say genetics did not play a role here. But if I find a relationship, I can't say it is genetics. It could be, but I can't separate those two. And so what researchers have to do is find ways that we can tease those two apart. How could I differentiate between the influence of genetics versus the influence of the environment? Yeah?
If you survey children that were not raised by their parents.
Okay, so one way I could tease that apart is I could look at kids that were raised by somebody other than their biological parent. And so I could make a comparison, how similar are they to their biological parent versus how similar to their adoptive parent. That would be one way. If I had my clone situation, I could easily do it, but since I don't have my clone situation, what's my next best bet to clones? Twins. Alright, so if you think about twins, when we look at twin studies, there's two different types of twins. By the way, anybody in here twin? Oh, bunch. Fraternal or identical? Alright, if we're right. That's the most twins I've ever had in a class. So, we got two different types of twins. When we talk about fraternal twins are also called dizygotic twins. Identical twins are called monozygotic twins. And this distinction is important because when you look at monozygotic or identical twins, the way those twins form is one egg is released from the mother. That egg is fertilized by a single sperm from the father. And then once fertilization has happened, then that cell splits. And you have two organisms that share 100% of their genetic material. Identical twins, 100% the same genetic. With dizygotic twins or fraternal twins, a rare instance where two eggs are released at the same time instead of one. Each of those eggs is fertilized by a different sperm. And so you have two organisms, two fertilized eggs that develop in the mother that are no more similar genetically than any sibling. And so on average, they're 50% shared genetics. So in twin studies, what I can do as a scientist is I make the assumption, one, that the only difference between a group of identical twins and a group of fraternal twins, the only systematic difference is in genetics. One group, they share 100% of their genetics. One group, they only share 50% of their genetics. Everything else, I'm making the assumption that they're in an equal environment, that anything else between them is equivalent. And so if I could make a comparison, how similar are identical twins on extroversion compared to how similar are fraternal twins on extroversion? Now I've teased apart environment. I've held environment constant. The only difference is a difference in genetics. And so if I find, which we do, that identical twins are much more similar, they're a much stronger correlation in extroversion than I find in fraternal twins, that points to a genetic impact. That the only reason that difference exists is because it's a genetic difference. So twin studies gives us an advantage. Again, it lets us separate those two. It teases apart that environment. But it comes with that assumption. And some researchers have argued that's an invalid assumption. If you look at the environment in which twins grow up in, this assumption is saying if you're identical twins, or if you're fraternal twins, really there's no difference. But there are subtle differences. Like, for instance, identical twins tend to be, way more than fraternal twins, dressed the same way. They tend to have names that sound more similar. But most research that's looked at it don't find other striking similarities. They don't have any striking differences. So we go under the assumption that environment's the same. The only difference in those two pairs is genetic. And so any differences we find in the characteristic, we attribute to a genetic difference. Now, in addition to the twin studies, we also have adoption studies that are disposable. So here we have individuals that are taken away from their biological parent, raised in a home, where they share no genetic similarity with their adoptive parent. They're only raised by their adoptive parent. They share 50% genetic similarity with their biological parent, but the biological parent had no deal in raising them. So now you have a comparison between shared genes and shared environment. And which one's going to show a stronger correlation? Now, again, you can do these types of studies with any type of variable. I've started with extroversion. And I will say for extroversion for sure, research shows that even when a child was never raised, they could be taken at birth, raised in a different home, the correlation between the child is stronger with their biological parent than it is with their adoptive parent. And you look at that finding, and by itself, again, it doesn't say here we've proven anything, but it strongly suggests that, at least in the case of extroversion, certain personality characteristics, that the upbringing has very little impact, that the genetics themselves play a much larger role. So yeah, we've got these different techniques, and there are huge, huge studies that have been taken on. The Minnesota Twin Study has been going on for years and years and years. They've got hundreds of thousands of pairs of twins that they have studied over time to look at how these different characteristics pan out using this type of research. Now, so that's the research. That's how we would do it. Now, what information does it give us? So if I wanted to just give an estimate, how much of the variability in extroversion or in height or whatever you want to talk about, how much of that individual difference variability is accounted for by genetics? Well, we have a tool that it gives me an estimate for that. The name of this estimate is a heritability estimate. And heritability has to do with the extent to which individual variation can be attributed to, explained by genetic similarity. So this estimate, this heritability estimate, it's going to be a number. It's going to be a number similar like the correlation, a percentage. And so, for instance, research has shown in numerous studies that the heritability estimate for extroversion as a personality characteristic is about 0.4 to 0.5. 50%, and this is a difficult concept. It's a statistical concept to really get. But this heritability estimate it's trying to give you a number to say, if I look at the variation in that score, again, I'll have a mean, and from that mean, I have variance away from that mean. The identical twins don't have exact scores. The fraternal twins don't necessarily have exact scores. There's going to be differences. How do I explain those differences? So statistically, how can I explain for the variance in these outcomes? A certain percentage, I say it's because of the similarity in genetics. And that number does not in any way talk about you as an individual. It doesn't talk about the individual. So when I say personality, extroversion, studies show in general 40 to 50% of the variability is due to genetics. It does not mean that for me, the reason I'm extroverted is 50% because of my parents' genetics. That makes no sense to say it that way. It says, in general, when we look at large-scale studies, in this time, at this place, I can explain this much variability because of that genetic link. Now, in addition to, so for intelligence is a factor that's been studied for a long time. This shows the correlations that exist between different pairs. So the first one, you've got identical twins reared together. So the study's completed. Everybody takes an intelligence test. You get a score on the intelligence test. I have a large number of people. I put those scores in. I find what's the correlation. For those individuals that are identical twins, the correlation between themselves and their twin pairs across a large sample, that correlation is like 0.85, which is incredible. I mean, that's a very strong relationship. I compare that, who they share 100% of their genetics, and they share 100% of their environment. They're raised in the same households. So I've got both of those going together. Compare that to identical twins reared apart. Here, the genetics are exactly the same, but now they're raised in a different environment. If environment played no role, those correlations should be the same. They're 100% the same genetics. If environment didn't play a role, the correlation should be identical, but notice it's not. The correlation for those guys is only 0.72. So we have a decreased relationship because they're raised in different environments. But notice the next one. Next one's fraternal twins reared together. So here, they've got the same environment, but they only share half their genetics. And the correlations for them is only 0.6. So we could do this. You could do this for multiple iterations and see what's the difference. And here we can separate. Both are the same. One I separate environment. One I separate the genetic part, and you see how those make an impact. And so we can make an estimate from that. So like intelligence, the estimates are closer to like 70% of the variability in intelligence is taken up by genetics. Now here's the other slight flaw, you could argue, in terms of the heritability estimates. That number is solely based on whatever study is done. And that is the number that you get, how much of that variability is accounted for by genetics, is totally influenced by how similar the environments are. So if you think about, we use nutrition and height. So height, it's estimated in different studies, the range for how much of the variation in height is attributed to genetics ranges somewhere between like 0.4 and 0.7, which those are big discrepant numbers. If you look at the United States, the amount of that variation says it's closer to 0.7. 70% of that variation is because of genetic differences. If I go to Haiti, for instance, and I do a study, and I look at the twins, and I do it, that heritability estimate will be much lower. It'll probably be closer to 50%. Anybody tell me why I would find a difference between those two? So, in the United States, we have a much more stable system of food. And nutrition is one of the biggest factors that plays into height outside of genetics. And for the most part, although there are people that don't have enough food, for the most part as a society, our nutrition is fairly well up there. So it doesn't have that much of an impact. Most people are getting the same. But when you go to another country that has more variation, you've got a huge difference between what the rich are eating and the poor are eating. Then that individual differences you find, it means the environment plays a much larger role. So the heritability estimate will be less. Now, as I've been discussing it so far and talking about nature, we focused on genetics. But when we're talking about the impact of nature versus nurture, genetics is not the only piece that we look at when you think of the nature side. And so other specific factors that we would say can impact your developing mental processes and behaviors would be other biological mechanisms. Specifically things that we talk about when we talk about brain behavior. So maybe I can account for some differences due to different brain structures or functioning. So why would one individual be more outgoing, extroverted? Well, there's a theory we'll talk about later in the semester that says what influences introversion and extroversion has to do with a region of the brain. You remember we talked about the reticular formation, which was a band of tissue that comes up through the brainstem, goes up, spreads out. Well, that reticular formation has two pathways, one going up and one coming down. And there's a theory, Hans Isaac said that how sensitive you are to stimulation in that region of the brain is going to lead you to become introverted or extroverted. And if you have really high sensitivity to stimulation, and you go into a party and the party's loud and there's stuff going on and you're just like, this is overwhelming, I would much rather go to the library and sit down in a quiet environment. Well, being introverted, the argument is that it's because of a specific structure in the brain. So mainly it is nature, but it's not genetics per se. It is, we can attribute it to a specific area. Or maybe we can use it in terms of neurotransmitters. If you look at differences in depression or anxiety or other factors, maybe you can say it has to do with an overabundance or non-functioning neurotransmitter system. Maybe it has to do with serotonin or dopamine. Or maybe I can explain differences in aggression by fluctuations in hormone levels and testosterone. So here I could say, here's a characteristic now. How can I explain it? Well, I could say it's due to a neurochemical that's leading to those differences versus you were raised in an environment where you were watching television violence and the reason you're aggressive now is because of learning. Maybe it's because of you've got more testosterone. Or as most developmental psychologists say, it's probably a combination of those factors. It's not just one or the other. But right now we're talking about the biological. The third area, when we talk about nature and biology, is the possibility of evolutionary forces having a role. Now, when I talk about evolutionary factors, I want to begin this. I could care less about talking evolution that we evolved from the smallest organism. Okay? If you have problems with thinking that we didn't come from Adam and Eve, or that you don't think we developed from, amoeba, or however you want to say it, that part's irrelevant to me as a psychologist. When I talk about evolution, and evolution playing a role in human psychology, the way we think and act, the main part about evolution that I'm talking about is the process of natural selection. And what natural selection basically says is that the characteristics that an organism has that increases their chances of survival and or reproduction are going to be passed on. And it's as simple as that. And if you don't, I don't know what your knowledge base is in terms of really understanding evolution and natural selection. When you hear the word natural selection, what comes to mind? A phrase? Survival of the fittest. Okay? And so it seems like what natural selection says is the strongest, the fastest organisms, those are the ones that are going to survive. But that's a bit of a misnomer. Because really, what natural selection says is, if an organism has a characteristic that in any way provides an advantage so that it is more likely to survive predation. And if it survives, it gives it a chance, a better chance than if it's dead, to actually reproduce. And so if it reproduces, then it has passed down the gene that regulated that mechanism that helped it survive to begin with. So if you've got this characteristic, so let's think of humans, early humans, okay? At some point, humans developed language. And with language, you can more easily communicate. And the organism that first, however what it is, that had the genetics that gave it the ability to start to form words, to communicate in some more meaningful way. Right there, that gave it a survival advantage. That organism had a better chance to survive. And so, had sex, passed on that gene, the children have that characteristic. And they survive more. And so it becomes more prolific in the population. Those are the factors we're talking about. Now, how does that play into psychology? There's a whole field of psychology, evolutionary personality psychology, that argues many of the characteristics that make us humans are probably here because of evolutionary forces. So one area that this field goes into looks at characteristics that are common to all humans. And argues that these characteristics have come about because at some point in our past, they provided an advantage. Now, that advantage in modern society is not an advantage for some of these characteristics. So, like for instance, if you think about how this would play out in terms of a characteristic that's common to all humans. So all humans experience anxiety in some form or another. Why? Is anxiety beneficial to us? And does anxiety in some way, in our distant past, evolutionary past, was anxiety a mechanism that actually increased the chances that organism would survive? And so there is an argument from evolutionary theory here that says anxiety probably first developed as a means to keep an individual within a group. That many aspects of anxiety come around in terms of social interactions. And so this is a hypothesis from this theory that would argue that if an individual long ago was wanting to survive, you had a much stronger chance of surviving a group. Okay? Distribution of resources provides access to mates. There's all kinds of reasons why groups are successful. All right? Well, so if I back then had thoughts of doing something, taking somebody else's mate, stealing food to provide for myself, something that would get me kicked out of the group, and I had no mechanism to stop me from it, then I would adulterate, I'd get kicked out of the group, and now I'm not going to pass my genes on, so that's not going to survive. But what if I had a mechanism that was called anxiety, and any time where I started thinking about, I want to do something that might get me kicked out of the group, I start to feel anxious about it, and it prevents me from doing it, then I stay in the group, I survive, and I pass that gene on to my kids. The ones that didn't have that characteristic survive at a lower rate. The ones that have the characteristics survive at a higher rate over time. It just becomes more and more common in that situation. Foods. Think about food preferences. If you had a choice between eating vegetables, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, and Oreo cookies and potato chips, which would you go for your snack? I mean, now maybe some of you are health conscious and you're like, oh, I take the vegetables. Most of us have a taste preference for sugary, sweet, fattening foods. It's like we've got when they talk about an obesity epidemic in the United States. We've got easy access to these foods. Well, from an evolutionary standpoint, the reason we all have this sweet tooth and the taste for that is because it used to provide advantage. If you look at individuals, why would it be advantageous if you had, and it's all related to genetics, if you had a gene that was a preference for sweet, fattening food, how would that help you? Could that be advantageous to have that gene? Okay, so if you have to go without food for a long time, those are high caloric things. So if you have high sugar, high fat, it provides more ready energy sources. Back before you had grocery stores you could go to and get whatever you wanted, you might go long periods without food. You had to work your butt off to get food. And if you had a preference to say, hey, I'm going to choose this food, this fruit that has good nutritional content, good sweet value, I want this fattening stuff that's going to last, give me provide more energy, you're more likely to survive. Today, it doesn't help us so much. But the idea is, in the past, it did. If it provided advantage, then it should keep going on. Now, again, that area says we have commonalities. We can try to explain this. The other area, that evolutionary theory does, is in looking at differences among groups. And particularly, differences between men and women. And what evolutionary theory, again, using the same context, evolutionary theory should say the only reason that you would find differences between men and women is if somehow that behavioral difference gave them an advantage to either survive and or reproduce. And if there is a differential advantage between males and females, then it should play out in different outcomes between them. So who knows what your knowledge is about differences between the genders. I bet you can come up with some. I'll give you just a few tidbits and facts in terms of sexual behavior. So if you did not know it, men think about sex more than women. Men masturbate more than women. Men are absolutely more likely to initiate sexual contact than women, and men are by far more likely to have casual sex than women. Those are just like some tidbits that have a ton of research behind them. Now, I want to explain why. Why is it that men want to have intimate relations more than women, or think about it more than women? Is there a rationale that I can use to explain it? Any thoughts here? Those are findings. Those are like facts. Multiple studies have shown we find differences between men and women. If you did not already know that you have these types of differences. But I want to know why. Any theories, guesses, hypotheses? You don't even have to talk about, I'll talk about what evolutionary theory is going to say. I want your explanation. Okay, so maybe that the difference, it's a biological mechanism, and maybe it's just totally related to testosterone. And we can kind of test that hypothesis because we can look at differences in men, how much testosterone they have. We can find, is there a stronger, you want to have more partners or whatever with men. We can compare women to men to testosterone levels. We can compare with individual women testosterone levels. So maybe that could account for some of it. You think of why men, give me another reason for why men are more likely to initiate sexual activity.
Men typically, just in terms of biology, it takes less effort to make a child than the woman's part. So
Okay.
Biology would push you to have as many children as possible.
Okay, so you're going with my evolutionary explanation here. Actually, you're fitting correctly there. Non-biological, can you give me another reason why men might be more inclined to initiate? Critical thinking. You're just like, you don't even tell us this. We 100% believe it's evolutionary theory. You have an alternative. Yeah?
The men don't have to be pregnant if something happens.
Okay, so what's that matter?
When did this
So
turn to
the
sex?
men don't have to go through the pregnancy,
I
and
don't
so
think this-
women are like, I don't want that, so I'm less likely. It's possible. I can just think of like social constraints. I don't know how you were growing up, but I know like as a male, my friends and I, we'd always like kid each other, talk about it. It was like, oh man, come on, you gotta have sex and all this stuff. And
think of that
I don't
too,
think the
I
girls were saying that same thing.
Wait, what?
There was like pressure for males, and I think it's still the same. But when I was in high school and college,
it's different.
if you were a male
Okay,
and
if
you
I'm-
were
If I missed anything, it's all
having
recorded
sex,
anyways.
you were like, yeah, man. Your male counterparts were like, oh. And if you were a woman that was having sex, people were calling you a slut. That doesn't happen anymore. I bet it does to some extent. But think about this. What I'm saying is, some of that could be explained in terms of learning. That the culture says these are right. Now, what evolutionary theory says, it goes with what a couple of movies are. It said the reason we would find these differences is because the behaviors would lead to an advantage, one way or the other. And so if you think, what's the difference? What's the major difference between males and females that have to do with sexual behavior? It has to do with the amount of effort, somebody said, that you have to put in to reproduce. Because you can argue, and the argument would be, it's in our genes to reproduce. That we are driven, maybe it's part of our genetic blueprint that says we want to pass our genes down to the next generation. And so what is the most effective way to increase the chances that our genes are going to get passed down? Is there an advantage, one way or the other? And would that advantage, that reproductive difference, would that lead to systematic differences in behavior? And evolutionary theory says absolutely. So if you look at what factors do women look for in a mate? If you're looking for a partner, are there certain things that you seek out? If you're a man, are there certain things that you seek out? And can I explain them in terms of evolutionary factors? So I'll just start out here. We'll do a couple surveys. So if you think in terms of advantage, okay,
What the fuck was that?
what characteristics, what traits do women tend to seek out in males? And again, there's research to back this up. I'm just making this stuff up. And in my question, because I'm leaving it to evolutionary explanation, in my question, there are certain characteristics that it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. You want in a partner. Most people want honesty in a partner. They want somebody who is funny. What I'm asking, are there things that are different from what women say they would want versus what men would want? So a woman would want somebody who is more mature, who's thoughtful. And again, the thoughtfulness, I think, goes either way. What else do women seek? Okay, what kind of affection? When you say affection. So we'll get opinions here. Okay, so you're saying women want more emotional.
Oh, I wanted to yell that
Is that
out.
what you're saying with affection? All right, yeah.
Yeah.
So when you think that's different between men and women? Okay, possibly. Anything else, women, that stands out? Okay, that have characteristics that are good with family. So they have like characteristics that would be a good parent, perhaps. Men or women, saying what you think men want. What do you think men seek out in a partner?
Physical features.
Such as?
Tits.
But okay.
Big ass.
That's a first. Okay, physical features. So men look for physical features.
Doesn't know how to react.
What else?
I want to say ass so bad.
Don't. Yeah, we've already.
Say it again. Won't play with your feelings. So you want somebody who manipulates you. Anybody else? Now, that means what? I want to hear you.
I want to say it so bad.
What other factors would women or would men look for in a mate? Yeah.
Women who are healthy,
Who are healthy. And why?
because it's more likely to make your children healthy.
You're more likely to be able to conceive children with a healthy mate. Absolutely. All right, so now, you got another one? It's like her mom, okay? And why? That's a totally different explanation. And so
I completely
so she
missed what I
said-
just said.
She said
Like your
men
mom.
look for somebody like their moms, and somebody could make a counter argument that says women are looking for somebody like their fathers, which goes in a
So
whole
it's like an
different
Oedipus complex.
all right, so that's one thing. So one idea is basically when you're trying to select a mate, what characteristics do you look for in a mate? Are there systematic differences? The other one is, let's say you're trying to attract a mate. So you want to have a partner. What do you do to try to attract a partner? And do men and women take different strategies here? How do women attract try to attract a partner.
Come on,
Say it
makeup.
again. Makeup, okay? Emphasize physical features. What else? Okay, and again, humor is one goal. Goes both ways, yeah. Being full of damsel in distress, perhaps. Anything else? Like women, if you think, what do you do to try to attract a mate? Yeah.
How they present themselves on social media.
All right, so I think that goes both directions in that one. Okay, so maybe what you wear, dress is more important. So if you think about the industry surrounding women, makeup industry, clothing industry, fashion industry, all the way up through plastic surgery and all the things that can go on there. Most of those things are designed to increase attractiveness of the female. Now, what about men? What do you do? Well, so what do you mean? So you
What?
no, you're talking about social factors. So what I'm asking is, what do you do to try to get somebody to like you? What's that? Hygiene. That's good. Yes. I'm sure everybody in your will agree that is definitely good. It is specific to men. That's your thing. Yeah. Okay, so maybe some of it is showing dominance in some way, showing physical dominance, which would be gaining muscle. Well, you got another one? Okay, well, so in some, facial hair is going to signal maturity. When you get older, not so much, but maybe that's a factor.
I feel like men just like to show off like the financial status.
Okay, so show off their financial status.
Yeah, I was gonna say, take her out to eat, pay for her dinner.
Hey, okay, so there. You got another one? Last one. I couldn't buy her. Okay, I wasn't going with Zach. That's like more like Giuseppe's, but.
Buy her what?
Seeds?
All right, so now think about this.
What is that like
You
jewelry or
named some
something?
differences.
This is
If
buy her
we
back
go and
seeds.
we look at some research
Look
to
her
find
back
what differences
seeds.
we find, there's some
No,
systems
I don't know. Buy her back
very
seeds. I thought I heard that.
clear, very robust,
I don't know what that
cross-cultural. And those differences are men tend to prefer women who are younger. Of course, that depends on their age. Younger men, like you look at teenagers, they want a woman that's slightly older than them. Individuals in their late teens, early 20s, they're more attracted to individuals around the same age. And older men are more attracted to younger women. Okay? That's a universal finding. Women, when they say what they're looking for, they say they're looking for either some type of status, they're looking at what men present, their financial situation, they're driving a nice car. Men present themselves. You try to attract women by showing off those things, showing off dominance, showing off wealth. And what men say they're looking for is younger women who have characteristics that we say beauty, but those characteristics basically pan out to showing fertility. So if you think men are seeking women who are younger, have wider hips, childbearing hips, other physical features that show fertility, they're looking for clean skin, which shows health, because that's going to increase the chances that if they reproduce, that they're going to have a healthy child. Women, on the other hand, tend to look for older men who are more financially secure, because if they have sex and they have a child, the argument from this theory is they need somebody to protect that child. And here's the big difference why. It's because for women, you've got an incredible investment. You've got to get pregnant, carry a child for 9-10 months, and then after the child's born, if you want that child to survive, you've got to have resources available. Men, what do you need to do to pass children on, to pass your genes on? Have sex. That's pretty much it. That was like the early comment. That was like, women have this tremendous investment, men do not. So now think, if your goal is to increase the chances of successful Now, what would be the best strategy? Now, as I'm saying this, I'm not taking into account ethics, morals. I'm saying early humans. What is your best strategy? For men, what is your best strategy to make sure you pass on your gene? And how are you going to have more children? And so have a whole bunch of sex. Who should you be having sex with?
Your wife.
One partner, not multiple.
People with diseases. If you want to pass successful offspring on, you should be choosing women who are ready to reproduce, that are healthy, that are childbearing years. So the argument would be the best strategy for men would be have sex with as many women as possible. I told you this is not ethics or morals.
That's what Genghis Khan did.
Oh, with that one, okay. That makes more sense. So the idea would be, I increase my chances of having successful reproduction by having sex as much as I can with as many people as I can. And I want to select, it's better to select women that are going to have increased chance of successful childbirth, which are going to be younger women who are healthy. And again, the ideas of fertility go with what we say are beauty. For a woman, what's your best chance to pass on? Does it matter how many people you have sex with? In terms of number of children you produce? No. Men have an unlimited number of offspring that they can have. Essentially. There is a record.
What?
There's a
And well, Genghis Khan is not official. Maybe the argument is the official count.
Who's counting records for kids? 500.
Well, I'm pretty sure it's 888. Okay? Now, for women, maximum number of child a woman can have.
32.
On average, I mean, like now.
Average, oh, no.
But on average, for a woman, 12 to 15 is really towards the top end. You have 19 in county or 20 in county, whatever it is. So there are exceptions. And there is a record for women. 888 for men. Idea for women? 69.
Hey. You know what she said?
So,
She was like, hey, get us this.
but that's like, I mean, that's like exceeds really the top end. So now think about this. Wait, I need your attention. We're running out of time. So evolution would say the factors that would increase your chances for successful reproduction based on the role in reproduction is going to lead to different behaviors. Men, as a man, you should increase the chances that you get your genes out there. Have sex with a wide variety of women. Women,
Good
you
God,
have
Richard. Jesus
different
fucking
offspring.
Christ.
You want to make sure those offspring survive. And so what should you look for? You should look for a man that has resources to provide, that's likely to stay with you, that has good parenting roles. And so the argument would be, because of this difference, we still got time, we still got more going on here. I'm going to step away. Because of that difference in the role of reproduction, it leads to differences in behavior. And we clearly see the differences in behaviors. And it fits the hypotheses that would be derived from evolutionary theory. It doesn't mean it's correct. There's all kinds of explanations. But this would explain it in that way. Now, so far, all we've talked about, again, is the nature side. Even when I talk about nature, we've got multiple things. We've got strictly genetics. We've got the mechanisms, the chemicals. We've got evolution. And evolution is dependent on genetics. Okay? All that's the nature side. Well, now, your makeup, your personality, the way that you act, the way that you think is not 100% genetics. There are other factors in the environment that could play a role. And so some of the avenues that psychologists have looked at in this nurture side, to start with, is when you are in the womb, you can be influenced by nurture, by the introduction of chemicals that can influence your development in the womb, by your mother's nutrition, the vitamins she takes. So there's all kinds of environmental impacts before you're even born that can influence you. Once you are born, then you can think about what is the environment in which the child's raised in. In my original scenario when I had clones, I was like, I'm going to get one group of clones that randomly assigned, and they're going to just get crap conditions. They're going to be living on the ground. They're getting bare nutrition. I've got another group that they've got everything that they need. The way to kind of describe that, or the simple way to describe that is it an enriched or a deprived environment? So if you did not have good nutrition, we know that can have an impact. If you were provided with a loving family versus an abusive family, that can have an impact. If you were provided with educational materials. And so think about this. When we talk about intelligence, this is a good example. Later in the semester, we'll talk about intelligence. I said, you know, estimates are 70% of the variable in intelligence is genetic. That means 30% is not. Well, some of that 30% is you're raised in an environment where education is modeled, where you're read to, where you have access to books, where you have good school systems. Versus you don't have those things, and think how those factors can influence your development. We can talk about parental and peer influence. So how your parents interacted with you, the bond that you formed with them, how your peers, talk about social influence. That whether you start smoking, drinking, or doing whatever because your friends talked you into it. You can also have cultural influence. So that could be certain things are taboo in some cultures versus others. Other things are acceptable, and that has an impact on you. As you should be able to see. Right? I've spent the majority of the time we were talking about the biology end of it. There's tons of research that looks at all the nurturing end of it too, but it's less clear, and it depends on what the characteristics are. But those are kind of the areas, and you can probably think who you are today. How much of that has that been influenced by the people that you've been around with? If I think about how happy and healthy somebody is at a particular point in their life, can I look back and say this is probably dependent on what happened to them in their first couple years of life? Whether they were provided an environment that was loving, trusting, and now the person is really suspicious of they have terrible relationships. The argument would be maybe some of these factors play a role. Maybe some of it is it's just biology. But the other parts, it could be something else. And the biggest key factor I want you to get out of this is it's not ever really nature versus nurture. It is really nature and nurture. And they interact. And so let me give you my last example here. We've got a couple minutes of class when I talk about interaction. So imagine, we'll go back into my original extroversion characteristic. And let's say that there is some genetic component to that, and I have a child that's born towards the extroversion side. And I'm going to compare that to the child that's born maybe towards the introversion side. They're almost right in the middle, genetically. And now one of those kids that's slightly more extroverted, maybe because of that genetic preference to start with, they naturally spend more time looking in their parents' eyes. They smile more. They engage in, young-wise, whatever behaviors be related to extroversion. And because they smile more, their parent interacts with them more, which then causes them to smile more, which then leads them to be more extroverted because they're getting reinforced with that behavior. You take the other kid who's introverted, and maybe in this circumstance, the parent's depressed. And when the child starts out, they're just barely on the introversion side, so maybe they start out smiling, but the parent doesn't respond to it. And so they quit. And it leads them to act in a more introverted way. It's not because just their genetics, it's because their way their genetic presented themselves led to different reactions, which then modify. So it's an interaction between these factors. So, although we're talking about it this class, and this is what we focused on, these concepts run throughout everything, so it'll continue to come up. Next class, we'll be talking about developmental psychology, which is directly